Hello again and welcome back to the Harvest Manager configuration series. In this chapter, we'll be taking a look at the Harvest Data Requirements configuration. The Harvest Data Requirements configuration defines which harvest data are relevant for a given use case. We define which harvest data variables as well as which harvest methods and numeric variables are applicable to the use case. We can also define if each harvest data is required or optional. In the database, it has this abbrev in the configurations table, HM harvest data requirements config. Now, let's try to define the harvest data requirements for this example use case. So we have a prompt here, and it says that for the wheat crop, selfing cross method abbrev, not fixed germplasm state, make the following harvest data and harvest methods available. So for harvest data, it specifies harvest date, which has the hvdate underscore cont variable abbrev in the database. And it states here that this is a required input and it's a date input. We also have grain color with this variable abbrev in the database. It's marked as an optional input, and it's a selection or a drop-down, and the options will be the scale values of this particular variable. In addition to the harvest data, we also have the following harvest methods that are applicable for this use case. First, we have bulk, which has the abbrev equal to bulk. And here it says that no numeric variable is applicable for this harvest method. In addition to that, we also have single plant selection. And this harvest method requires a numeric variable, which is number of plants. It's defined to be a single integer input, and the minimum value must be 1. So, based on this prompt, let's try to build our harvest data requirements configuration. Before anything else, let's write the criteria. So again, in the prompt, it mentions that the wheat or the crop is supposed to be wheat, cross method abbrev is selfing, and the germplasm state is not fixed. And applying what we've learned in the previous chapter, we can write the criteria or the config item in this way. We define the criteria with the crop code, the cross method abbrev, and the state. So crop code equals wheat, cross method abbrev equals selfing, and state equals not fixed. And then we add, for now, an empty config object, which later on we will be populating as we learn how to define the harvest data requirements configurations. So far, this is our working configuration item. Let's go to the next panel. So now let's take a look at the config structure for the harvest data requirements config. The config property of the harvest data requirements configuration consists of two sub-properties. First, we have harvest data, which is a JSON array, defines what harvest data are applicable to the use case. And then second, we have harvest methods, which is a JSON object, and this defines what harvest methods are applicable to the use case. Depending on the method, we can also define any applicable numeric variables for each method. So first, let's take a look at the harvest data subproperty. So this subproperty, as mentioned earlier, is a JSON array, and each JSON object represents a harvest data variable that is relevant to the use case. Each variable definition item has the following properties. First, we have the variable abbrev, which is the abbreviation of the variable in the database. So you can check the master.variable table in the database for more information. Next, we have API field name, which is the return value field name that the Harvest Manager API endpoints will be using. So yes, this configuration also affects our endpoints. So it's important to define the API field name here, as it will be the main source of the reference for that variable. Next, we have required, which is a Boolean value, meaning true or false. And this dictates whether or not the variable is a required input. If it's set to true, the plots or cross will be flagged as having incomplete data in case there are no values or no value is specified for this particular variable. However, if it's set to false, then it means it's an optional input. Next, we have the input type. And this is the type of input that will be rendered in the UI for this particular harvest data. So to see the input types, let's check out this documentation. So as of March 24, 2025, we have the following supported input types for our harvest data. The first one is the date picker, and this renders a date picker input for data variables, including date variables like harvest date and crossing date. This input type does not have any supported input options, so we can define it in this way. We specify the variable abbrev, API field name required. It can be true or false, and then the input type we set it to date picker, and then we just leave the input options as empty since there are no options applicable for this type. And once we define this in the harvest data requirements configuration, in the UI we should see something like this. So this is a date picker input. When you click on it, it will render a calendar date picker input, and you can select the date that you wish to specify for a particular plot or cross for a variable, for example, harvest date. Moving on, we have the select to input type, which renders a drop-down option. This can be used for inputs that allow values from scale values, such as in grain color. So to define this in our harvest data requirements, we define it this way. So we have the typical info for variable abbrev, API field name, and required, and then we set input type to select to. In input options, we then add an option named use scale values and set the value to true. And in the UI, it will render something like this. So we have a drop-down option, and whatever the scale values are for that particular variable will be set as the options for this input. And finally, our last supported input type is number. So this is a number or numeric input. And then in the input options, we are required to add the input subtype, which will dictate what kind of number input will be accepted by this input. So we have two supported input subtypes. The first one is single int, which accepts single integer inputs. For this subtype, we are required to specify an additional input option, which is the minimum value, to dictate what is the minimum allowed value for this number input. So we can define it like the following. The input type is set to number, and then the subtype is set to single int if within the input options, and we add the minimum value, which it can be any integer value. For example, in this case, we set it to 1 as the minimum. And in the UI, it will look something like this. It's a number input, and you can toggle it up or down depending on the need or what value you want to input. Then finally, the other input subtype is the comma separated integer, or comma sep int. So this accepts comma separated integer values, for example 1, comma 2, comma 3, and so on. And then integers here are automatically sorted and duplicates are removed upon input. So for example, if I input this for comma 2, comma 10, comma 5, comma 5, comma 3, it will automatically be reformatted to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. And then for this input subtype, no other input options are needed. So you just have to add input type equal to number and specify input subtype comma sep int within input options. And in the UI, you should be able to input something like this. Going back to our presentation. So that's how you define harvest data within the harvest data requirements configuration. So that goes within here. So now, going back to our prompt earlier, so it mentions that the harvest data for the use case we want to define is the following. We have harvest date, or hvDate cont, which is a required date input, and grain color, which is a selection or drop down, which uses the scale values as the option. So the way to define this is the following. So first, we have here in the harvest data, the first definition is for harvest date. So we add the variable, the API field name. We add the required parameter and set it to true. And then the input type is date picker because this is a date input. So now in the UI, we will be required to input this for this use case. And then additionally, we have grain color. So again, abrev, API field name, and then required is set to false because this is optional. In the input type, we set select to, and then in the input options, we add use scale values equal to true. So now in the UI, it should render a drop down where the options are the scale values for the grain color variable. So now we have our harvest data definitions for this use case. Next, let's take a look at the next subproperty within the harvest data requirements configuration. The next one is the harvest methods subproperty, which is a JSON object, where the keys are the harvest method abbreviations and the respective values are an array which contain numeric variables that are relevant to the harvest method if there are any. The numeric variables follow the same structure of the harvest data definitions, and typically they use the number type. Right now, only a maximum of one numeric variable is supported per harvest method. So let's take a look at how we can define this. So going back to our prompt, we have the following harvest methods defined. So we have two harvest methods. The first one is bulk, which does not require any numeric variable. And the second one is single plant selection, which does require a numeric variable, which is number of plants, where it's a single integer and the minimum value is 1. So to add the bulk harvest method, we just add a key equal to the harvest method abbreviation, which is this one, bulk in all caps. And then since there are no numeric variables applicable, we just specify an empty array for bulk. Up next, for single plant selection, it states that it requires a number of plant input. So now we will define the input options for number of plants. So we have the variable abrev, API field name. Required is set to true because it's required for this particular harvest method. And then for the input subtype, we have single int, and the minimum value is equal to 1. And that's it. We have our definitions for the harvest methods applicable to this harvest use case. So now, combining everything we have so far, we will come up with this config item. So this config item will have the criteria as stated earlier. And then we combine the harvest data and harvest methods that we came up with earlier. So in the config, we have the harvest data property, and we have the harvest date definition and the grain color definition here. In harvest methods, we can see the bulk and single plant selection methods, and in under single plant selection, we have number of plants. So this is our final config item, and all that we need to do now is to add this to the harvest data requirements configuration as one of the config items in that config. So now let's actually take a look at a demo on how this works. So I'll just switch right now to a sample occurrence that I made under the bread wheat program on my local. So upon loading this occurrence, you can see the plot records here, but you'll notice that there are no input fields or columns for the harvest data right now. And that's because I haven't specified any config items yet in the harvest data requirements config. So what I want to do is I'll take this configuration item that I have earlier, and I'm actually going to add it to the harvest data requirements configuration that I have in my local database. So to do that, I'll just go to my pgadmin, and I'll add it here. So you can see I'm updating the harvest data requirements config. I have an empty array so far, and within this empty array, I'll add the configuration that we just came up with. So upon updating this, we should be able to input the harvest data that we have specified for this use case. So before I do that, I just want to show the germplasm first. So this is actually a not fixed germplasm. So all of the germplasm here in this occurrence is not fixed. And all of, for plot level harvest, the cross method abrev is automatically set to selfing. And the crop of these germplasm is also wheat. So it should match our criteria over here. So now, every time we update the harvest data requirements config, we need to log out and then log back in. So that's because we only load the configurations in the UI once to avoid performance issues on the UI side. So now I've already applied this new configuration. So I'll just try to log out of the system, and I'll log back in and go back to Harvest Manager and see if there are any changes in the UI. So I'll go back to Harvest Manager, and then I'll load my sample occurrence again, which is this one, HMDemo wheat 001. And upon loading the plots, we can see that now we have input fields for the harvest data that we have specified in our harvest data requirements configuration. So first off, we have harvest method, and you can see we have the two specified harvest methods available here. We have bulk, and then we also have single plant selection, which if we select this, it will enable the numeric variable input for number of plants. So for example, let's try to input 4. And then we also have harvest date. So as we mentioned earlier, harvest date is a required input. So for this use case, so it should be specified. So let's try to add the harvest date just for the first plot, just to see what the effect will be. And then grain color is an optional input. So let's try to input it for the second plot. So even if we don't mention or input grain color, then we should have no problem since it's an optional input for this particular use case. So now that we were able to input, let's go to the creation tab. Alright, so our harvest data requirements configuration are also being used during validation and during rendering of the remarks here in the creation tab. So here we can see that once we have the harvest date and harvest method equal to bulk, we really don't need anything else. So this is considered complete data. However, look at the plot or the second plot for this example. We did not input any harvest date for this, but as we've seen, This is a required harvest data input, which is what we defined in our configurations. So now it's showing as missing value harvest date. So even if I click on the commit button here, so it will run through the validations and still it will be marked as incomplete since the harvest date is missing. So let's go back to the harvest data tab. So now the first plot is marked as ready, which means it's ready for harvest record creation because it has the complete harvest data. However, the second one is marked as incomplete data because it's missing the harvest date input. So that is how the harvest data requirements configuration works in Harvest Manager. So it renders the input columns, and then it also handles the validations upon committing the harvest data so that the correct status is applied based on the completeness of data of a given plot or cross record. So before we move forward, I'll try to just delete this first, the data for the second plot, and then let's actually try to harvest the first plot. So since it's saying that it's ready, so you may think that once we click the create button in the creation tab, then we should be able to produce the harvest records. But let's see if that's actually the reality here. So now I have this, it says in the remarks, it says it's ready for creation because we have the complete data, in this case harvest date and harvest method equal to bulk. So let's try to click on this, on the create button and proceed with the creation of harvest records. So that was quite quick, but let's take a look at the notifications. So as you can see, the notifications here says that the creation of harvest records failed. So let's take a look and go back to the harvest data tab and try to find out why the harvest failed here. So another improvement that we have in Harvest Manager is after the harvest process, we make there are available harvest summaries for the plots or cross records. Regardless if the status is failed or completed, you should see the remarks. So this is denoted by this info symbol here. If you hover above it, it says view harvest summary. So let's click on this one and it will display this plot harvest summary modal, for example, which contains basic information related to the plot as well as messages or harvest summary. So in this particular plot, we have an error message, and it says that the harvest failed because there is no harvest use case behavior configuration found. So that's why our harvest failed here. Even though it was marked as ready because the data is complete, we still have more configurations that we need to define to ensure that the harvest will be successful. So actually in the next chapter, we'll be taking a look at this harvest use case behavior and see how we can define the behavior and outcome of this particular harvest use case via this configuration. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for listening.